She lost the house her late husband had built for their son. The authorities demolished it in a single day. But beneath the foundation, they found something they shouldn't have seen. Now, the woman and her child are being watched by machines, and a night in the forest became the beginning of someone else's game. Subscribe and write which city you are watching from. Sarah Milton woke before the sun, as she did every morning, long before the world around her stirred. Her small suburban house was quiet at this hour, wrapped in the pale blue hush of early dawn. The heating system clicked softly somewhere in the walls, and the refrigerator hummed its steady, familiar drone. She lay still for a moment and listened to the silence, trying to gather strength for another day. It always took her a few minutes to move from the fog of sleep into the reality of her life. The life of a widowed mother raising an 8-year-old boy who had lost his father far too soon. She rose, pulling on a sweater against the morning chill, and padded into the hallway. A series of photographs lined the wall. Her husband, Elijah, smiling in the sunlight, holding baby Liam in his arms. Elijah with a backpack over one shoulder, waving at the camera from some old hiking trail. Elijah kneeling next to the tiny wooden playhouse he had built for their son years ago in the backyard. She avoided looking too closely at the pictures when she could help it, but this morning her eyes lingered. The ache in her chest, the one she had learned to live with, tightened just a little more. In the kitchen, she began assembling breakfast automatically, her movements the product of habit alone. A bowl, a spoon, cereal, milk. She set everything out for Liam, knowing he would wander in half asleep any moment. As she waited, she glanced out the window. The sky was just beginning to brighten, an almost invisible line of pale color spreading across the horizon. A street lamp flickered and shut off, surrendering the world back to daylight. Footsteps approached, soft and dragging. Liam shuffled into the kitchen, his hair sticking out in all directions, and his eyes still heavy with sleep. He looked much smaller than his 8 years when he first woke up, a slight boy with narrow shoulders and a gentle face that still carried traces of baby softness. He climbed onto his chair and mumbled a quiet, "Morning," then lowered his head over the bowl. Sarah reached out and gently smoothed his hair. "Eat slowly, sweetheart. You've got time." He nodded without looking up. She watched him silently, feeling again that strange mixture of tenderness and fear that had followed her since Elijah's death. She had always been a careful mother, but since then she felt a sharp edge in everything, a sense of danger that hovered just outside their routines. Liam seemed to feel it too. He had grown quieter, more cautious, as if constantly listening for something she could not hear. When breakfast was finished and Liam was dressed, they drove toward the school. Traffic was mild, the usual mix of parents rushing to work and children walking in small clusters, with backpacks bouncing against their spines. Liam pressed his forehead lightly to the window and watched the houses pass. He always seemed lost in thought during these rides. Sometimes Sarah wondered if he was imagining the forest again, the one place where he seemed to shed the heaviness he carried. After dropping him off, she drove to the medical clinic where she worked as a nurse. The shift passed in a blur of patient charts, temperature checks, and brief, polite smiles. By the time she returned home and parked the car in her driveway, she felt drained, her energy scraped thin. Still, when she stepped into the house and smelled the faint scent of pine drifting from the hallway, coming from the old wooden boxes Elijah had brought back from his forest trips, a different part of her heart stirred. She checked the clock. Liam would be home soon. And after that, she realized, they could drive out to the forest. The thought gave her strength. The forest had become the only place where they both breathed freely. The small wooden cabin Elijah had built for their son stood there, hidden deep in a patch of evergreens, so dense that dusk always seemed to arrive earlier beneath their branches. The cabin was small, almost laughably so, if judged by any objective measure. Yet to Liam, it was a world in miniature. And to Sarah, it was the last tangible piece of her husband's love, carved into wood and preserved by time. She picked up Liam after school, and his face brightened the moment she said they were going to the woods. The transformation was immediate, a light blooming behind his eyes. As they drove, the suburban streets gave way to long stretches of road, flanked by towering pines and quiet fields. Gradually, the sounds of the city faded behind them. The gravel path that led to their forest property was rough, but familiar. The tires crackled over stones, birds darted between branches overhead, and a faint scent of damp earth filled the air. Liam pressed his palms against the car window and leaned forward as though trying to get closer to whatever lay ahead. When they finally stopped the car, he leapt out and ran forward, his steps quick and sure. Sarah followed, carrying the small picnic bag she always brought. The woods greeted them with that cool, whispering silence unique to deep forest, the kind that felt both ancient and, somehow, watchful. The cabin appeared between the trees like something out of a memory. Built on short wooden stilts, it looked small enough for a single person to lift, yet sturdy enough to survive storms. The walls were weathered to a soft gray, the windows framed by uneven boards Elijah had sanded by hand. The porch creaked gently when Liam climbed onto it, and he swung the door open with the enthusiasm of someone returning to a sacred place. Inside, everything remained as Elijah had left it. Wooden shelves held small treasures Liam had collected, pine cones, smooth stones, a bundle of dried flowers he had gathered with his father. A tiny lantern hung from a nail near the entrance. The floor creaked warmly under their feet, each sound an echo of the man who had built it. Sarah stepped inside and inhaled deeply. Every board, every nail, every scent carried Elijah's presence. She could almost hear the ghost of his laughter, the scrape of his tools as he worked late into the night, shaping this hidden sanctuary for his son. They stayed for hours. Liam played near the stream, tossing leaves into the water and watching them float away. Sarah sat on the porch, listening to the sound of the forest. Sometimes she caught Liam glancing toward the underside of the cabin, where the stilts lifted the wooden structure from the ground. He did this often, she realized, as though something under there interested him, or worried him. When the sun began to set and shadows stretched long across the forest floor, they packed up their things. Liam looked back at the cabin with a strange expression, something between longing and unease. Sarah told herself she was imagining it. Days passed peacefully until one afternoon, an unexpected letter arrived. The envelope bore the insignia of the local administration. Inside, printed with cold precision, was a notice informing her that the forest parcel she owned was being seized by the government for an environmental development project. She was required to vacate and clear any structures from the land within 48 hours. Sarah reread the letter 3 times, each time hoping she had misunderstood. But the meaning was unmistakable. The government wanted her land, and they wanted it quickly. Her first instinct was disbelief, the second was fear. How could they take away the cabin, the one place where Liam still felt connected to his father? She dialed the number on the letter, only to be placed on hold, transferred repeatedly, and finally brushed off by someone who sounded annoyed she was even calling. No one offered a clear explanation. No one cared that her son's memories lived in that cabin. She drove to the administration office the next morning. The building was sterile, its lobby decorated with bland posters about community initiatives. A thin, polished man in a suit greeted her with a professional smile that never reached his eyes. He spoke in vague phrases about ecological priorities, land reassignment, and public good. When she asked specifically why her parcel was necessary, he simply shrugged and said the order came from higher levels. But there was something in his gaze, something calculating, that unsettled her deeply. When she left the building, her hands were trembling. 2 days later, heavy machinery rumbled down the gravel road toward the forest. Sarah and Liam stood helplessly beside the car as workers in reflective vests unloaded chains, hooks, and equipment. The polished man from the office arrived too, clipboard in hand, checking something off as he surveyed the cabin. Liam clung to Sarah's arm, his face pale. "They can't take it, Mom. They can't." "I know, sweetheart. I know." A crane operator raised the metal hook, aligning it with the cabin's support beams. The wooden structure groaned as the chains tightened around it. Liam struggled, trying to run toward the porch, tears spilling down his cheeks. Sarah held him tightly, whispering assurances she barely believed herself. The cabin rose. It lifted slowly, tilting, swaying like something alive fighting against its own destruction. Boards squealed, dust drifted from the seams, and for one brief second, Sarah thought the whole structure might collapse midair. Then the crane shifted, and its massive metal claw scraped against the earth. A deep, resonant clang echoed through the forest, so out of place, so wrong, that everyone froze. The claw had struck something beneath the soil. Workers hurried forward, brushing aside dirt. As the loose earth fell away, a flat, gray surface emerged, a solid concrete slab, smooth and for too deliberate to be natural. The polished man stiffened. His expression, once controlled, flickered with unmistakable fear. Sarah noticed. She also noticed how frantically he ordered the workers not to touch it, how he kept glancing over his shoulder as though expecting someone or something to appear. She pulled out her phone and took several photos, ignoring the man's sharp warning. Liam tugged her sleeve and whispered, his voice trembling. "Mom, Dad used to look there a lot, like he was checking something." Her heart twisted painfully. Suddenly the cabin, the secrecy, the way Elijah had insisted on buying this particular patch of forest, it all felt heavier, thicker, with meaning she could not yet grasp. When the demolition crew left for the day, and the forest fell silent again, Sarah stood beside the newly exposed slab and stared at it for a long time. The concrete gleamed faintly under the afternoon light, almost as though it had been waiting for this moment, for someone to notice. Something inside her shifted. She looked down at her son, who wiped his eyes and tried to be brave. She placed a hand on his shoulder and whispered, "We're coming back tonight." And for the first time since Elijah's death, Sarah felt the stirrings of something she had almost forgotten existed. Purpose. Night settled over the forest with a kind of deliberate heaviness, as though the darkness itself understood what Sarah was about to do and wished to warn her. The trees, which earlier seemed welcoming in their familiar silence, now towered like dark sentinels against the pale sky. The gravel road crackled softly beneath the car's tires as she drove slowly toward the place where the cabin had stood only hours before. Liam sat in the back seat, a flashlight resting in his lap, his knees pulled close to his chest. He didn't speak much, but his eyes stayed glued to the window, watching the shadows slip between the trees like restless ghosts. Sarah's hands tightened around the wheel several times during the drive, each time releasing only when she forced herself to breathe. She kept replaying the sound of metal striking buried concrete, the sudden shift in the polished official's expression, the way his composure had shattered for a single instant. There had been fear in his eyes, not surprise, as though he had expected something to be there, as though he had come looking for it. The memory made her stomach twist. Elijah had been a man of many small secrets. Quiet, thoughtful, often lost in his own world, but he had never given her reason to doubt him. Yet now she found herself thinking of the nights he had returned late, the afternoons he had spent alone in the forest before building the cabin, the way he'd always insisted that particular spot on their land was perfect. Perfect for what? For their son, or for hiding something he didn't want found? When they reached the beginning of the footpath leading to the clearing, Sarah parked the car and turned off the engine. The headlights dimmed, leaving only the faint glow of the cabin's absent memory ahead. She looked back at Liam. He was pale, but steady. Braver, she realized, than she had been at his age. "Stay close to me," she said softly. "I will," he whispered. They walked through the trees together. The wind stirred the branches above, shaking loose a few dry leaves that spiraled down around them. Distantly, an owl hooted. A fox darted across the path, its eyes flashing briefly in the beam of their flashlight. Everything felt alert, as if the forest were holding its breath. The clearing came into view at last. The ground where the cabin had stood was a dark, uneven patch of earth, surrounded by stray splinters and fragments of wood. A few nails still glinted under the starlight like tiny metal bones. And there, at the center, was the concrete slab. Even from a distance, it looked wrong. Too smooth, too perfectly shaped, too intentional. Sarah approached it slowly, her heartbeat echoing in her ears. Liam remained so close that his sleeve brushed hers with every step. The slab wasn't large, perhaps 8 feet by 8 feet, but the surface showed marks that were impossible to overlook now that she was up close. Scratches, faint lines, something that resembled paint worn away by decades underground. She crouched beside it and touched the edge. The concrete was cold, unnaturally so. Liam knelt next to her. "Mom," he murmured, pointing with his flashlight. "There." She leaned in. In the corner of the slab, almost invisible under a thin layer of soil, a small symbol had been carved. 2 letters. E.M. Her breath caught. Elijah Milton. It was like being struck in the chest. 100 memories flooded her at once. His handwriting on sticky notes he used to leave in her lunchbox. The initials he carved into a tree during one of their first hikes. The way he used to sign letters during their brief courtship. Always with those same, slightly crooked letters. Now they were here, buried under the cabin he built for their son. She straightened slowly, swallowing hard. "Help me clear more dirt," she whispered. Together they brushed away soil with their gloved hands. Inch by inch, the concrete edge revealed more detail-thin seams running parallel to each other, forming a perfect border. That was when Sarah realized what she was seeing. This wasn't a slab at all. It was a door, a hatch. Her pulse quickened. She rose and circled the perimeter, searching for a handle or latch. Nothing. Just smooth concrete and those faint seams. The artist of this thing, whoever had designed it, had intended for it to be invisible. But Elijah had left his mark. Maybe it wasn't a mistake. Maybe it was a message for her. Liam's flashlight beam followed her movements. "Mom, can we open it?" The question made her pause. He looked small standing there on the uneven earth, small but determined. Elijah would have been proud of that look. The thought strengthened her resolve. She knelt and ran her fingers along the seam again, pressing lightly. The concrete panel didn't move, but beneath the soil, her fingertips brushed something metallic. She scraped at the dirt until a corner of a small metal plate appeared. She cleared more away until an old combination lock was revealed, a dial-style mechanism built flush into the concrete surface. Her breath trembled out of her. "It's a hatch," she whispered to Liam. "A hidden one. And your dad. He put a lock on it." Liam touched the dial reverently. "Do you know the code?" She shook her head. "Not yet." But as she stared at the lock, memories stirred. The first birthday after they bought the forest land, Elijah gave her a necklace engraved with 4 numbers. 0712. She had joked that it was silly to give her a combination instead of a romantic symbol, but he'd only smiled and said, "Sometimes numbers mean more than they seem." Was it possible? She touched the lock with trembling fingers. The metal was cool and gritty beneath her skin. Slowly, she turned the dial. 7, 1, 2. A faint, distinct click broke the silence. The hatch shifted. Liam gasped softly, and Sarah's heart lurched. She pulled at the edge where the lock sat and felt the panel give way. It rose, heavy but movable, revealing a square opening beneath. Cold air wafted out from the darkness below, carrying with it the stale scent of long-abandoned spaces. A metal ladder descended into the unknown, each rung coated in a thin layer of dust that made it glimmer in the flashlight's beam. Sarah stared into the hatch for a long moment before turning to Liam. "Stay behind me," she whispered. "Keep the light steady." He nodded, gripping the flashlight tightly. Sarah descended first, her shoes clanking softly against the metal. The space below was just large enough for a person to move comfortably. The walls were made of steel, riveted together with cold, precise seams. The air felt as though no one had breathed it in years. A small table sat in the center. Dust-covered shelves lined the far walls, and to the left of the ladder stood an old metal locker, its door slightly ajar. Liam climbed down behind her, his face pale, but eyes wide with curiosity. "What is this place?" he whispered. Sarah's answer came in a quiet voice that barely felt like her own. "Something your father didn't want anyone to find." She moved deeper into the room, her shoes stirring dust into the air. The light illuminated a pile of documents, stacked neatly on the table file folders, stamped with faded government seals, many marked confidential or restricted access. Some were dated from decades ago. Others had no dates at all. The metal locker creaked when she pulled it open. Inside hung an old rain jacket Elijah's. She recognized it instantly. The stitching on the sleeves, the patched right pocket, the frayed collar he had always meant to fix, but never did. A sob rose unexpectedly in her throat, sharp and painful. She pressed her hand to her chest and shut her eyes tightly for a moment. "Mom," Liam whispered, touching her arm. "He left it for us." She nodded wordlessly. There was more. On the shelf below the jacket sat a small metal case, sealed with a clasp. Next to it lay several photographs, grainy images of men in protective suits, moving large barrels through the forest, trucks unloading containers under the cover of night, a map with red X marks scattered across areas not far from their land. As Sarah sifted through each piece, dread pooled in her stomach. These weren't random images. They were evidence of something dangerous, something illegal, something Elijah had been involved in before he died. Finally, her gaze fell on an envelope lying alone beneath the photos. Its edges were yellowed, and on the front, in handwriting she knew by heart, were her name and her son's. Her hands shook as she picked it up. Slowly, she opened it. Inside was a letter. Several pages, written in Elijah's familiar, careful script. She read the first line aloud, her voice cracking. "If you are reading this, it means they found a way back to the forest." Liam stepped closer, clutching her sleeve. She read more. Elijah had worked in an environmental enforcement unit years ago. He and his team had discovered illegal chemical dumping in protected lands. The perpetrators included people within the administration, people with power, influence, and connections. When the team reported their findings, they were threatened, silenced, and forced out one by one. Some disappeared. Others were framed. Elijah had fled the job and tried to start over, but he never stopped fearing they would come for him. He had stolen copies of evidence and hidden them beneath the cabin he later built for their son, disguising the hatch as part of their peaceful life. "I bought this land to protect you," the letter read. I built the cabin so no one would look deeper. If they ever try to take the land, it means they know. And if they know, you must be very careful. Do not trust the local authorities. Protect Liam. And if you can, finish what I couldn't." Tears blurred the words. She clutched the pages against her chest, sinking onto the small metal bench beside the table. Liam wrapped his arms around her waist and rested his head on her shoulder, and for a long time they simply stayed like that, the silent room holding their grief and fear like a sealed vault. Eventually, Sarah wiped her eyes and steadied herself. She gathered the documents, the photographs, and the letter, placing everything into her bag with careful hands. She didn't know exactly what she would do next, nor how deep the danger ran, but she knew one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever Elijah had died for, it wasn't finished, and now it lived in her hands. She looked at her son, whose eyes glistened in the dim light. "We need to go," she said softly. "We can't stay here any longer." Liam nodded. "Will they come back for it?" "Yes," she whispered. "They will." Together they climbed the ladder and stepped back into the forest's cool night air. The hatch closed with a dull thud, sealing away the hidden room once more. But nothing was hidden anymore. Not from them. Not from the danger ahead. Sarah took Liam's hand, and without looking back, they walked toward the car, the weight of Elijah's truth pressing heavily on their shoulders. The forest rustled as they left, as though warning them that what had been uncovered tonight was only the beginning of something far larger, far darker, and impossible to escape. Morning came quietly, as though the world itself was unaware of the terrible weight that had shifted in the night. The first rays of sunlight slipped through the blinds in soft stripes, brushing across the living room floor where Sarah had finally collapsed after hours of pacing. She had barely slept at all. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the hatch, the cold steel walls beneath the earth, the files marked confidential, and Elijah's handwriting whispering warnings from years ago. She saw Liam's face too pale, but determined, illuminated by the dim beam of the flashlight as they read his father's letter together. When she did sleep, her dreams were jagged and restless, filled with silhouettes moving through forests, trucks without license plates, and faceless men knocking on her door. It was the knocking that woke her. 4 slow, heavy thumps against the wood. She shot upright, her heart seizing painfully. For a moment she didn't know where she was, but the familiar sight of her hallway came into focus. The house was still dark. Liam was asleep in his room, curled beneath his dinosaur blanket, unaware of the danger that might be waiting on the other side of their front door. The knocking came again. She rose quietly and padded toward the door, her breath sharp in her throat. Through the peephole she recognized the polished official, the same man who oversaw the cabin demolition, the one whose eyes had flickered with fear when the concrete slab appeared. He stood on her porch with a practiced posture, his hands clasped behind his back, as though this were a polite visit and not a storm breaking against her life. Sarah swallowed hard and unlocked only the chain, opening the door just a crack. "Mrs. Milton," he said, with a smile that didn't belong on a human face. "Good morning. I'm sorry for the early call, but I was in the area and thought I might stop by." Her gut twisted. In the area at 7 in the morning? No one was in the area at 7 in the morning unless something had gone wrong. "What do you want?" she asked quietly. "Just a routine follow-up," he replied. "We're finalizing the reassignment paperwork for the forest parcel, and I wanted to ensure we didn't overlook any questions on your part. Transitions like this can be—" He paused, pretending to search for the word. "Emotionally complex." Emotionally complex, as though he hadn't torn her son's heart out by ordering the cabin lifted from the earth like garbage. as though he wasn't part of whatever Elijah had warned her about. "I don't have questions," she said flatly. "But I do," he answered, leaning slightly closer. "I noticed you stayed at the site later than expected yesterday. We prefer citizens not linger around construction or demolition zones. Safety concerns. You understand." Her pulse hammered. He knew. She forced herself to keep her voice even. "My son was upset. We were only there for a little while." His smile sharpened. "A sensitive boy. I saw how attached he was to the structure." Structure. He couldn't even call it a cabin. "Anyway," he continued lightly, "should you need anything, feel free to contact my office. We want this transition to be smooth for you." He lowered his voice, the friendliness slipping like a mask peeled from wax. "And I do hope you understand the importance of cooperation in these matters." Sarah closed the door on him so sharply she heard the wood slam. She pressed her back to it and exhaled shakily. The threat had been subtle, but unmistakable. He hadn't come to check on her. He had come to confirm what she might have seen. As she stood there, trying to steady herself, she heard footsteps in the hallway. "Mom." Liam's small voice drifted toward her. He rubbed his eyes as he approached. "Who was that?" She didn't want to lie. Not to him. "Just someone from the administration," she said gently. "Nothing you need to worry about." But he saw right through her. He always did. "Is it because of what we found?" She placed her hands on his shoulders and knelt to meet his eyes. They were so much like Elijah's, warm, curious, too perceptive for their own good. "Everything's going to be okay," she whispered. "But we need to be careful. Very careful." He nodded solemnly. "I won't tell anyone." Her throat tightened. He should have been thinking about math homework and dinosaurs, not hiding state secrets left behind by a father he barely got to know. But the world had taken that innocence from him when the cabin was lifted off the ground. Later that morning, after breakfast, they left the house briefly to walk to the corner store. Sarah needed some air, needed to convince herself the world was still real, still normal, still something she could hold together. As they turned onto the main road, a black SUV rolled slowly down the street. It was sleek, tinted, and moved at a pace that suggested no destination other than observation. It passed them once, then again from the opposite direction, and finally it stopped at the far end of the block, engine quietly humming. Sarah felt the prickle of fear crawl up her spine like cold fingers. Liam grabbed her hand. "Mom," he whispered. "That car." "I see," she murmured. They turned around and went home immediately. That afternoon, the mail arrived. Among the usual envelopes was one with no return address. When she opened it, her breath froze. Inside was a single sheet of blank paper. Blank except for the faint, greasy fingerprint smeared across the corner. A message. A warning. Someone telling her they could reach her any time. She folded the paper and threw it into the fireplace. Flames swallowed it greedily. When she turned, she saw Liam watching her silently from the doorway. There were no questions in his eyes, only understanding. That terrified her more than anything. Over the next few days, the tension grew thicker. The black SUV appeared often. Sometimes a different car, a navy sedan with fogged windows, sat parked halfway down the street with someone inside pretending to read a newspaper. Twice she found her mailbox open when she returned home. And once, when she left work late in the evening, she noticed a man across the parking lot who seemed to be watching her closely. When she stepped toward him, he turned and walked away quickly, disappearing behind a row of dumpsters. Her sleep deteriorated. Her appetite faded. Every noise in the house, every creak, every rustle, every distant car, door sent adrenaline surging through her. Liam stayed close to her side, his trust unwavering, but she could see the worry settling into him. shaping his young face into something older. One night, after she tucked him into bed, Sarah sat on the floor of her bedroom and spread out the documents stolen from the underground room. The dim light of the bedside lamp illuminated pages filled with dates, inspection codes, chemical formulas, photographs of forest clearings where toxic waste had been dumped. She flipped through them slowly, absorbing every detail. There were names, too. Signatures. Trails of authorization. The same governmental seal repeated again and again, linking the crimes directly to people in positions of power, not just decades ago, but recently. Many of the names she recognized from the very administration attempting to seize her land. Her heart pounded as she traced one signature with her fingertip. The polished official from the demolition site. A clean, elegant signature in black ink. He had been involved in the cover-up. He had been there from the beginning. And now he was standing at her front door. Her breath trembled. Elijah hadn't been paranoid. He hadn't been hiding from shadows. He had been hiding from men with power men, capable of ruining lives and erasing evidence. Men who had already taken everything from him. Men who had likely taken his life. The realization struck her with such force that she had to close her eyes. She saw Elijah's tired smile, the way he used to hold Liam when he thought no one was watching, the quiet way he had built the cabin, board by board. He must have known this day might come. He must have known that one day the forest would no longer keep his secrets safe. She pressed her palms against her face, fighting the wave of grief and rage rising inside her. When she lowered her hands, Liam was standing in the doorway. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. He walked over and sat beside her, his small shoulder touching her arm. After a moment, he reached into the pile of documents and pulled out a small notebook. It was one of Elijah's old field journals. Sarah recognized the cracked leather cover. "I found this in Dad's box," Liam said quietly. "I didn't want to show you before because it made me sad. But now, I think he wanted us to have it." She opened the notebook slowly. Inside were pages of cryptic notes, sketches of ravines, coordinates, lists of chemical compounds, the initials of people he once trusted. Some pages had been torn out. Others had been scribbled over with frantic strokes of pen. But one page stood out. A simple map of their forest property with a red circle drawn around the exact place where the hatch lay buried. Next to the circle, in Elijah's handwriting, was a single sentence. "Not safe forever." Sarah closed the notebook and held it in her lap. Her hands were trembling, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "We're not running," she whispered. "Not anymore." Liam looked up at her. His eyes, those dark, steady eyes, held a shine she hadn't seen since Elijah died. A quiet bravery, a determination that didn't belong to an 8-year-old. "Dad didn't run," he said. Sarah nodded. "No, he didn't." She looked again at the documents, at the names, the crimes, the evidence of corruption stretching across decades. The questions that had tormented her since the cabin was lifted from the ground finally coalesced into certainty. The government wasn't trying to protect the environment. They weren't reclaiming land for conservation. They were trying to destroy the one thing that could expose everything they had done. And now that she understood the truth, something inside her hardened like iron. "Mom," Liam said softly. "What are we going to do?" She met his gaze. "We're going to finish what your father started." The words filled the room like a vow sealed in stone. But she knew the moment she said them that they were irreversible. The polished official would return. The cars would keep circling. The threats would get stronger. And the people who had covered up their crimes for decades would not hesitate to silence anyone who held the truth. The danger was no longer a distant shadow. It was here, watching them, waiting. Yet despite the fear, A strange calm settled over her. For the first time since Elijah's death, she felt the same sense of purpose she had felt the night they'd found the hatch, a conviction deep and unshakable. They weren't alone. They had Elijah's evidence, his notes, his warning, and each other. The next step, she knew, would change everything, and it would come soon. The next morning rose gray and heavy, the kind of morning that felt as though the sky itself were bracing for something inevitable. Sarah stood by the kitchen window long after the coffee pot stopped dripping, gripping the edge of the counter as though the solid weight of it could anchor her thoughts. Outside, the quiet suburban street stretched on as always. Neatly trimmed lawns, cars warming quietly in driveways, neighbors walking dogs in heavy coats. Nothing looked different. Nothing looked dangerous. And yet the danger was everywhere now, threaded through every corner of her life like an invisible net she could feel but could not tear. She turned and watched Liam eat breakfast at the table. He sat straight-backed, trying not to show how frightened he was. But she saw it anyway, the nervous tapping of his foot, the way he kept glancing at the window behind her, as though expecting someone to appear. He had taken on a weight no child should have had to bear, and it was her fault, or Elijah's, or the government's. She no longer knew where one blame ended and another began. All she knew was that the fear had settled into their home, like an unwelcome guest refusing to leave. But beneath that fear was something else, something steady, something powerful. Resolve. She reached across the table and placed her hand over Liam's. His fingers curled around hers slowly, as though he needed to make sure she was real. "We're going to fix this," she said softly. "Not today. Not all at once. But we will." He nodded without speaking. For a moment they just held hands in the quiet kitchen, listening to the familiar hums and clicks of their house sounds that had once been comforting and now felt fragile, temporary, as though they belonged to a world that was slipping from their grasp. The day passed slowly. Sarah made copies of every document using the old printer in the living room, its mechanical whirring filling the house with a steady rhythm. She tucked the originals into sealed plastic folders, organizing them by category, just as Elijah must have done years ago. Chemical disposal records, falsified inspection reports, photographs of hazardous waste barrels hidden in the forest, maps marked with secret dumping sites. Each page she touched felt like a piece of Elijah's story, a chapter of his life he had never shared with her. Each page made her heart ache. Liam helped in small ways. He brought her blank paper, sorted envelopes, fetched her a glass of water when she forgot to drink. He hovered silently at her side, as though afraid she might crumble under the weight of what she was doing. And perhaps she might have, if not for him. Once everything was compiled, she placed the copies into a thick envelope and stared at it for a long time. It felt like holding a bomb, a silent, ticking bomb that could destroy lives. Hers included. She couldn't keep it here. Not anymore. By late afternoon, the sky outside darkened, and rain began to fall in thin, cold sheets. Drops beaded and slid down the windows, blurring the view of the street. The world grew muted, softened, as though hiding itself under a veil. Sarah checked her watch. Then she walked to the coat closet and retrieved her jacket. Liam appeared instantly. "Are you going somewhere?" She crouched before him. "Just for a little while. I need to talk to someone who can help us." His forehead creased. "The man from Dad's stories?" She didn't know how he'd guessed, but she nodded. Elijah hadn't mentioned him often, but when he did, it was always with respect. A journalist, a friend who had once risked his job to expose corruption similar to what Elijah's team had found. After Elijah's death, Sarah had avoided contacting him. The grief had been too fresh, too raw, and she hadn't wanted to hear him say words like suspicious, unexplained, or cover-up. Now she didn't have a choice. Liam wrapped his arms around her, and she held him tightly. The fear of leaving him alone burned through her like acid, but she also knew she couldn't drag him into danger unnecessarily. Not tonight. "I'll be back soon," she murmured into his hair. "Stay inside. Don't answer the door for anyone." He nodded against her shoulder. She kissed his forehead, grabbed the envelope, and stepped out into the rain. The journalist lived 2 towns over in a modest, cluttered house, wedged between taller buildings. When she knocked on the door, it swung open almost immediately, and she found herself staring into the face of a man who looked far more worn than she remembered. His hair had gone grayer, his shoulders stooped, but his eyes were the same. Sharp, perceptive, instantly assessing her with a mix of recognition and concern. "Sarah," he said quietly. "I wondered when you'd come." She hadn't expected him to say that. The words rattled her, but there wasn't time to question them. Instead, she stepped inside, clutching the envelope close. The house smelled of old paper and strong coffee. Files and newspapers were stacked on tables and chairs. A laptop hummed on a wooden desk, screensaver flickering. The man motioned for her to sit, but she remained standing until she handed him the envelope. "For my son's sake," she said softly, "please read what's inside." He took the envelope, his brow furrowing, and opened it. As he sifted through the documents, his expression shifted from curiosity to shock to something far more serious. Several times he looked up at her, as though seeking confirmation that what he was reading was real. "This," he whispered, holding a photograph beneath the lamp's glow. "This is what Elijah died for." Sarah felt her breath catch. "He was killed, wasn't he?" The man hesitated. Then he nodded slowly. He uncovered something he wasn't supposed to. Something people with power wanted buried. And they're still trying to bury it. Tears burned in her eyes, but she blinked them back. "Then help me. Please, help us finish what he started." He closed the folder carefully. When he met her gaze again, there was no hesitation. "I will." For the next hour, they talked quietly, urgently, mapping out a plan. He would take the evidence to his editor, someone he trusted. They would investigate quietly, off the record, until they had enough to publish safely. It would take time. Weeks, maybe months. But once the story was out, the people involved wouldn't be able to hide anymore. Before she left, he placed a hand on her shoulder. "Keep Liam close. Don't underestimate what these people are capable of." Sarah nodded, thanked him, and stepped back out into the rain. By the time she reached home, the street was dark and quiet. She hurried inside, calling for her son the moment the door closed behind her. He ran to her from the hallway, relief etched across his face. "You're back," he said. "I told you I would be." That night, as the rain softened into mist, they sat together on the couch. Liam laid his head on her lap, and Sarah brushed back his hair, listening to the soft tick of the mantel clock. For the first time in days, she felt a sliver of calm, not safety, but purpose, a path forward, a way to honor Elijah's truth. It did not last long. Early the next morning, news broke across local channels, short, clipped segments, hushed commentary, reports of a sudden suspension of environmental projects in their county due to allegations of misconduct. No one mentioned names. No one mentioned missing evidence. But the panic was palpable. Calls from the administration began immediately. Emails flooded her inbox. The polished official demanded an urgent meeting, his tone no longer disguised behind courtesy. She deleted every message. By midday, a swarm of reporters gathered outside the administration building. The polished official's carefully kept composure had cracked. News cameras caught him shoving a microphone away, his face drawn tight with strain. Something inside their perfect system was unraveling. But Sarah kept her curtains closed. She had no interest in being part of the spectacle the government was trying to contain. 2 days later, the journalist called her. "It's happening," he said. "We're moving forward. Slowly. Carefully. But it's happening." Relief washed over her like a warm tide. For the first time since Elijah's death, she felt something close to hope. And so, on the first sunny afternoon, after days of cold rain, Sarah took Liam back to the forest. The clearing was empty, quiet, as though the land itself were holding its breath. The earth where the cabin once stood was bare, the soil dark and still damp. The hatch beneath lay invisible again, buried under a thin layer of dirt. No trace remained of the chaos that had consumed their lives. Only the trees watched them with their ancient, unblinking patience. Liam knelt beside the spot and placed a small wooden plaque he had carved at home. It leaned gently against a stone, freshly engraved with shaky, careful letters. Here lived love and truth. Sarah stood behind him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. A breeze moved through the clearing, rustling the branches overhead. It carried with it a faint scent of pine and earth and something else, something that felt like Elijah, like a whisper of reassurance drifting across time. She closed her eyes and let the moment settle deep inside her. They had survived the worst. They had uncovered the truth. They had taken the first steps toward justice. Elijah's voice echoed softly in her memory, steady and certain. "Protect Liam. Finish what I couldn't." She opened her eyes and looked down at her son. He gazed at the plaque with a solemn expression, but his eyes were brighter now, clearer, touched by a small but unmistakable spark of peace. Sarah reached for his hand. "Come on," she said gently. "Let's go home." And together, they walked out of the clearing, leaving behind a place stripped bare, yet finally, irrevocably honest. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe. Watch the next videos on the channel and share this one with someone who loves stories like this.